True crime. The night Trayvon Martin never made it home. Trayvon Martin and the rainy night that changed the country. A police cruiser pulls up outside a townhouse in Sanford, Florida, just after sunrise. The rain from the night before still clings to the pavement. A father is waiting for his son to appear, telling himself there must be some ordinary reason the boy never came back. Instead, officers ask for photographs. Then they show him one more image. It is not the one he expects. Hours earlier, neighbors had heard shouting in the dark, and then a single gunshot. Someone called 911. Someone said there had been a fight. By the time police arrived, a 17-year-old was dead. In those first hours, almost nobody outside that gated community understood what this case would become. For days, the story barely moved. No national uproar, no mass demonstrations, no wall-to-wall cable coverage. There was just a dead teenager, a man claiming self-defense, and a case that initially appeared to be destined for local files. It did not vanish. It became one of the defining criminal cases of modern America, not only because of what happened that rainy night, but also because of what the shooting forced the country to confront afterward. A teenager between two homes. Trayvon Martin is 17 years old. He lives in Miami with his mother. But in late February 2012, he is visiting his father and his father's fiancée at the retreat at Twin Lakes, a gated townhouse community in Sanford, about 20 miles north of Orlando. He is a high school junior. He still has family, routines, and the ordinary shape of a young life in formation. According to people close to him, he wanted to become a pilot. That matters because true crime often flattens victims into their final headline: a body, a shooting, a case file. But before Trayvon Martin becomes a national symbol, he is simply a boy spending time with family and stepping out on an errand that should have meant nothing whatsoever. He leaves to buy snacks from a nearby convenience store. The details become iconic because they are so ordinary. Candy, a drink, a hoodie in the rain. None of it suggests menace. None of it hints at danger. That contrast is part of what made the case resonate with such force. The image at the center of the story was not of an armed aggressor. He was a teenager on his way back from the store. Trayvon is black. The man who notices him that night is George Zimmerman, a neighborhood watch volunteer. From the beginning, the case carries a question far larger than one street in Sanford. What, exactly, made this teenager seem suspicious? That question would haunt every stage of the investigation and every argument that followed. The walk back through the rain. The scene is ordinary until it isn't. Trayvon Martin is walking back through the community after buying snacks. It is dark. The weather is wet. He is wearing a hoodie with the hood up and heading back to the townhouse where he is staying. Somewhere nearby, a man in a vehicle notices him. That man is George Zimmerman. He calls police and says the teen looks suspicious. In the first minutes, the event is not yet a national reckoning. It is just a judgment, a phone call, and a decision that will become impossible to undo. There had been recent break-ins in the area, which shaped the sense of threat inside the neighborhood. But fear in criminal cases is rarely neutral. It fixes itself onto someone. It chooses a target. Once Zimmerman made that call, the story began moving toward a confrontation neither side could later describe without dispute. At that point, the country knew nothing. There were no marches, no petitions, and no national campaign. There was only an unarmed teenager on foot and an armed adult who had decided he might be dangerous. Whether that decision was caution, profiling, overreaction, or some blend of all three would later split the country. But the chain begins here. Observation, suspicion, pursuit, and once that chain begins, it becomes impossible to stop. The call that changed everything. When Zimmerman called police, he described Trayvon Martin as suspicious. Those words became some of the most scrutinized in modern American crime reporting because they captured the moment when watchfulness became pursuit. The call did not merely document concern. It preserved the logic of suspicion in real time. This moment is where the case starts to harden into competing narratives. One side sees a neighborhood watch volunteer reacting to recent break-ins. The other sees an armed adult escalating an encounter with an unarmed black teenager who had done nothing more than walk through the rain in a hoodie. Between those narratives sits the central fact. Trayvon Martin was unarmed. The recording mattered because it froze a moment that could later be replayed, parsed, and argued over. Once the 911 tapes became public in March 2012, the case moved with extraordinary speed from local tragedy to national flashpoint. Federal civil rights investigators soon opened a separate review. However, the recording failed to address the most crucial question. It sharpened it. What happened between the report and the gunshot? Neighbors heard cries for help, and then a shot. Yet even that detail became contested. Whose voice was screaming, and who was in danger in those final moments? The uncertainty around those seconds would become central to everything that followed. The seconds before the gunshot. On February 26, 2012, Trayvon Martin was shot in the chest during a confrontation inside the retreat at Twin Lakes Community. The wound was fatal. Zimmerman informed the police that he had acted in self-defense after the attack. His version was that Martin punched him, knocked him down, and slammed his head into the pavement before he fired. The shot itself became a focal point because the physical evidence mattered so much. Trial testimony later examined the bullet path, the distance of the shot, the injuries on Zimmerman, and the position of the two men in the final moments. A defense forensic expert told jurors that the physical evidence was consistent with Zimmerman being beneath Martin when he fired. That did not settle the moral argument, but it mattered enormously in a criminal court built on reasonable doubt. There were witnesses, but no clean reconstruction. Some neighbors heard screams. Some saw fragments of a struggle. One witness testified that Martin appeared to be on top during at least part of it. Others were unable to confidently identify who was on top, who was on bottom, or whose voice was crying out. That kind of evidence does not produce certainty. It produces room for argument. That is why the shooting became more than a homicide investigation. It became a battle over starting points. If the story begins with an armed adult following an unarmed teenager, the confrontation looks reckless, even predatory. If it begins with a man on the ground fearing serious harm, the shooting looks like self-defense. Much of the country's argument turned on which of those stories people believed came first. Then came the decision that transformed grief into outrage. Zimmerman was briefly detained and released without arrest that night. For many individuals, this was the true catalyst. Not just that a teenager had died, but that the machinery of law seemed at first to stop moving. The morning after, and the first fracture. The next morning, Trayvon's father was still hoping for an ordinary answer. Instead, he was pulled into a reality no parent can prepare for. That shift, from waiting to confirmation, from uncertainty to loss, gave the case its first deep emotional fracture. This detail matters because it exposed the distance between official process and private grief. For investigators, the scene had already become evidence. For Trayvon's family, it was still a missing person question until it suddenly became a murder case. That brutal handoff shaped everything that followed. Attorney Ben Crump quickly began pressing for answers, for the release of evidence, and for an arrest. His argument was simple and devastating. If Zimmerman had stayed in his car, there would have been no confrontation or self-defense claim. It was a contrast the public understood immediately. An unarmed teenager with candy and a drink, and an armed adult with a gun. This was the first major public fracture in the case. It was no longer just a local police matter weighed against one man's version of events. It had become a grieving family's challenge to the logic of the investigation itself. They were not only asking what happened, they were asking why no one had been arrested. That question changed everything. When a local killing became a national uproar, the turning point was exposure. Once the 911 recordings became public, the stories surged across television, online platforms, and social media. A petition demanding Zimmerman's arrest drew enormous support. Soon after, the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division and the FBI opened a federal review. The case had now transitioned from a local homicide investigation to a national referendum. Protesters gathered around the country wearing hoodies, like the one Trayvon Martin had worn that night. Others carried candy and drinks as symbols of interrupted innocence. The imagery was simple, which is precisely why it worked. It reduced a tangled legal argument to one unforgettable picture: a teenager running an ordinary errand and ending up dead. Pressure fell not only on Zimmerman, but also on local authorities. Leadership changed. A special prosecutor was appointed. Florida's self-defense laws were pushed into the center of national debate. The case had become too large to be contained within Sanford alone. President Barack Obama added another layer when he said, "If I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon." More than a year later, after the verdict, he expanded that thought, saying, "Trayvon Martin could have been me 35 years ago." Those remarks mattered because they framed the case not only as a legal question, but also as a window into lived Black experience in America. The arrest that came 44 days later. For weeks, Zimmerman remained free. Every day without an arrest deepened the perception that the justice system did not value Trayvon Martin's death the way much of the country did. That delay became one of the defining facts of the case's public outrage. Then, on April 11th, 2012, the special prosecutor announced that Zimmerman had been charged with second-degree murder. The arrest did not settle the national argument. It intensified it. To Trayvon Martin's supporters, it was overdue. To Zimmerman's defenders, it looked like public pressure and politics overtaking due process. The state's theory was severe. Zimmerman had profiled Trayvon Martin, followed him, disregarded guidance not to pursue, confronted him, and then shot him. The defense answer was immediate and direct. Zimmerman would plead not guilty and maintain self-defense. From there, the case moved into the classic middle stage of major true crime stories: witness statements, forensic argument, contested timelines, and endless debate over what the evidence could actually prove. A shooting that might once have disappeared into local bureaucracy had become one of the most closely watched criminal cases in America. But charging a man and convicting him were never the same thing. That gap would decide everything. A trial built on fragments, fear, and reasonable doubt. By the time the case reached trial in 2013, the national debate had fully hardened. The emotional stakes were obvious. The evidentiary problem was harder. No one could reconstruct the final seconds with complete certainty. The prosecution told a story of escalation. Zimmerman saw Trayvon Martin, judged him suspicious, followed him, and set in motion a confrontation that never needed to happen. The defense told a story of immediate physical danger. A man knocked down, struck, and forced to fire because he feared for his life. Witness testimony did not erase the ambiguity. Some neighbors heard only fragments. Some saw only pieces of the struggle. Accounts varied on key points, including positioning and the cries for help. For prosecutors, that kind of evidentiary field is dangerous. For defense lawyers, it is fertile ground for reasonable doubt. Race hovered over the courtroom, even when it was not the formal legal question before the jury. Federal investigators later concluded there was insufficient evidence to pursue criminal civil rights charges, underscoring one of the hardest truths in the case: legal proof and moral judgment are not the same thing. In the end, the trial came down to one of criminal law's coldest realities. suspicion is not proof, outrage is not proof, and even a deeply troubling chain of events may still leave room for acquittal. The verdict that split the country. On July 13, 2013, a 6-woman jury found George Zimmerman not guilty of second-degree murder and manslaughter. For many Americans, the verdict felt like a second wound. For others, it was the expected result of a system built around reasonable doubt and self-defense. One of the most misunderstood parts of the case involved Florida's Stand Your Ground law. Zimmerman's team did not win the case through some magical legal shield. The defense rested on self-defense, while the public debate around the trial helped turn Stand Your Ground into a national symbol. That distinction mattered because the case came to represent far more than the precise mechanics of courtroom strategy. The streets filled almost immediately. Demonstrations erupted in cities across the country. Trayvon Martin's parents joined protests. The acquittal reignited arguments about race, profiling, vigilance, guns, and the vulnerability of Black life in spaces where suspicion can so quickly become danger. President Obama first issued a written statement urging calm, then days later delivered one of the most personal remarks of his presidency. He said Trayvon Martin could have been me 35 years ago, tying the verdict to a much longer American history of racial suspicion and unequal treatment. In the narrow legal sense, the case was over. In the American imagination, it was only beginning. The man at the center of it did not fade away. After the acquittal, Zimmerman did not disappear quietly. He remained surrounded by confrontation, police contact, and fresh controversy. In 2013, he was accused by a girlfriend of assaulting her and pointing a shotgun at her during a domestic dispute. Prosecutors later dropped the domestic violence case after the complainant changed her account and declined to cooperate. That is an important distinction. It was a serious allegation, but it did not end in conviction. That same year, Zimmerman was also questioned after his estranged wife called 911 and said he had threatened her with a gun. He was not charged in that episode. Again, it belongs in the story only as an allegation and a police incident, not as a proven offense. In 2014, he pursued a libel suit against NBC, arguing that edited broadcast material had defamed him by making him appear racist. A Florida judge rejected the suit, ruling against him. That mattered, because it showed he was still fighting over the public meaning of the case itself, not only the legal outcome. Violence and accusation kept circling his name. In 2015, another driver, Matthew Apperson, was arrested after shooting at Zimmerman's vehicle in a road rage incident near Orlando. Zimmerman suffered minor injuries from flying glass. Apperson was later sentenced in the case. Zimmerman was not the shooter in that incident, but the episode added to the sense that his life after trial remained entangled with confrontation and notoriety. Then came one of the most provocative acts of all. In 2016, Zimmerman auctioned off the gun used to kill Trayvon Martin. He described it publicly in inflammatory terms, and the weapon ultimately sold for $250,000. For many people, that act hardened the view that he was not retreating from notoriety, but monetizing it. This mattered because it kept the case alive in a different register. The courtroom battle was over. The cultural battle was not fought. Each new incident pulled the story back into view and deepened the sense that there had never been a clean ending. The federal review and the limits of civil rights law. After the acquittal, attention shifted to Washington. Could the federal government bring civil rights charges? In 2015, the Justice Department announced that it would not. Its conclusion was that there was insufficient evidence to pursue federal criminal civil rights charges against Zimmerman. That decision is essential to understanding the case because it exposes the gap between public certainty and legal standards. Federal investigators reviewed witness statements, crime scene evidence, phone data, ballistics, autopsy findings, depositions, and the trial record. They also conducted dozens of interviews, examined electronic devices, and retained an independent biomechanical expert. Even after that review, the department concluded it could not prove the necessary federal charges beyond a reasonable doubt. The Justice Department was careful in its language. It described Trayvon Martin's death as a devastating tragedy and said the case had sparked a painful but necessary dialogue. It also made clear that declining prosecution did not condone the shooting. It reflected the high bar required by federal hate crime and civil rights law. For the Martin family and for many observers, that closure deepened the sense that the system had offered no answer equal to the loss. For others, it confirmed that tragedy and criminal provability are not always the same thing. That distinction is uncomfortable, but it is central to why this case still lives in the national conscience. Why this case still matters. Trayvon Martin's killing still matters because it changed the language America uses to talk about race, threat, youth, and self-defense. It forced the country to confront a brutal question. When does suspicion become danger? And for whom? The case also helped shape the climate that gave rise to Black Lives Matter. After Zimmerman's acquittal, it matters because of symbols. 2. The hoodie became political. Candy and a drink became shorthand for innocence interrupted. Marches in Sanford, New York, Washington, Chicago, and beyond turned one local shooting into a national reckoning. It matters because the case revealed how differently Americans can read the same evidence. One reading sees reckless pursuit and a chain of avoidable decisions. Another sees a chaotic fight the state could not disprove as self-defense. Those competing readings did not end with the verdict. They became part of a continuing argument about law, race, and public space in America. And above all, it matters because behind every slogan, headline, courtroom argument, and political debate, there was a 17-year-old boy who left a townhouse for snacks and never came back. That is the simplest fact in the case, and the one least likely to lose its force. Trayvon Martin's story endures because it sits at the point where true crime stops being passive consumption and becomes a mirror. What America saw in that mirror in 2012 and 2013 is still shaping the country now